In the film Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, it's very appropriate that in the search for the Holy Grail, faith comes up quite a bit within the conversations of that film. We see on one hand Dr. Henry Jones, a lifelong seeker after the Holy Grail. We see him as a firm believer. While on the other hand, we have his son, Dr. Indiana Jones, who wants little to do with anything that is religious, apart from a purely academic and archaeological approach. But being left to his own devices hasn't always been the best thing for Indiana. While he's been successful as an adventurer archaeologist, he's had a lot of failures along the way as well, a lot of moments of chaos. And in fact, most of his adventures, while having a successful end, get there in the most chaotic way possible. Now, at the end of their search for the Grail, the Jones boys run into a group of Nazi Grail hunters. And in an attempt to make it so that Indiana will go through and, as they hope, get through all the tests and trials leading up to the Grail, they shoot his father. They shoot Dr. Henry Jones. And he's moments away from death. So the only thing possible that can save him is the healing power of the Grail. Now, Indiana's wits and knowledge get him through most of these trials. It's on his wits alone that he's able to do it. His cleverness gets him through. But then he gets to the final test. The final test being a leap of faith. Because there's a giant chasm. He can clearly see the doorway he's supposed to go through. But it's all the way on the other side of this chasm. There's no way in sight to get over there. So Indiana has to take that leap of faith, that moment of trust. So he does so. He sticks his foot out, lets himself go, and finds himself miraculously hovering. Because it turns out there was a bridge, but just with the right enough texture that if you look down, you can't see it at all. Now, it's thanks to this moment, thanks to this relinquish his own knowledge, his own wits, that ultimately saves Indiana. It's trusting in something else, trusting in what he cannot see, that gets Indiana Jones through to finally find the Grail. Trust. That's what faith really means. The word faith, it literally means to trust. And as we see in our reading from Hebrews this morning, we do not trust in God for those things that we can see. We trust God simply because of who God is. That is, that God is the one who is trustworthy. We're not following God because of anything we can see. We follow God not because of any promise that we've been given. We follow God not even because there is certain and definite proof. We follow our Lord because regardless of our ability to see, in spite of our ability to perceive, we know God, and we know God to be trustworthy. We could even say that God is the one, the only one even, that we can put our trust in. But regardless of that fact, we struggle to do so. We're all impatient when it comes to what God has to reveal to us. None of us like not being in control. Now, God does allow us to follow in our own ways, to follow the path that we wish to go on. That's the subject that we see in the prophets. We see it in our reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah this morning as well. We can always go our own way, but not without consequences. It leads to a lack of control and chaos. And we see this in the lives of stubborn men like Indiana Jones. Telling God to relinquish control leads to those paths, that certainty that God has placed before us, to crumble and fall away. It leads from a small and insignificant country like Israel to go from self-rule to all of a sudden being split into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom we heard about last week with Hosea, and the southern kingdom of Judah, which we hear about this week in Isaiah. And it leads to those nations crumbling further as the northern kingdom is consumed, assumed into the Assyrian Empire. And as the kingdom of Judah does the same years later, falling under the authority of the Babylonian Empire. The lesson here is that trusting in our own selves only leads to disaster. We see that in the stories in the Tanakh. We see it specifically in the prophets and the collapse of Israel. We have only to look at our own lives, or at the very least, the chaotic lives around us, the lives of those who bow to no one but themselves, to see the truth, that trusting in ourselves only leads to disaster. We see it even in the failures of our own lives. Seeing that our own control over ourselves isn't really control at all. We need to trust in something that's trustworthy, and that is God. You may not always see that fact, but it is true. You may not always see our Lord around us, and yet God is still there. He is trustworthy, and if we put our faith in him, we won't have to fall like the ancient Israelites. It's not that we won't have hardships along the way. But if we are patient in weathering the storm, we'll make it through those hard times to see the glorious end our Lord has in store.